My name is Gaurav Saini, and I work as Lead of Policy and Partnerships at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, CSDR, New Delhi. I will be your host today, and I'm delighted to welcome you all for this policy roundtable on nuclear risks in Asia. Before the chair, Ambassador Sood, introduces the theme for this roundtable, let me introduce the distinguished panelists. We have with us Ms. Hannah Hageland, who is a senior member of the technical staff at Sandia National Laboratories with expertise in the Indian Ocean region and South Asian regional security, nuclear issues, interstate crises, and risk reduction. She is a co-editor and author of Investigating Crises, South Asia's Lessons, Evolving Dynamics and Trajectories, published by the Stimson Center, and her analysis has been featured in policy outlets such as Foreign Affairs and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. We also have with us Dr. Toby Dalton, who is the co-director and a senior fellow of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. An expert on non-proliferation and nuclear energy, his work addresses regional security challenges and the evolution of the global nuclear order. He is the co-author of the book Not War, Not Peace, Motivating Pakistan to Prevent Cross-Border Terrorism by Oxford University Press. We have with us General Amit Sharma, who has served as the Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Forces Command of the Indian Army. He has served as the Director, Long-Term Force Structuring at the Integrated Defense Staff Headquarters. Additionally, he has also served as the Defense Attaché at the Embassy of India in Paris, where he was responsible for the Army and naval cooperation with France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. We are also pleased to have with us Dr. Manpreet Sethi, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi, where she heads the project on nuclear security. She is an expert on a range of nuclear issues, having published over 80 papers in reputed academic journals. She writes extensively on subjects related to nuclear energy, strategy, non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, and expert controls. She lectures regularly at leading establishments of Indian Armed Forces, police, and foreign services, and is the author of well-received books such as Code of Conduct for Outer Space, Strategy for India, and Nuclear Strategy, India's March Towards Credible Deterrence. And finally, to steer this roundtable, we have Ambassador Rakesh Sood. Ambassador Sood joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1976, serving in Brussels, Dakar, Geneva, and Islamabad in different capacities as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C. At the Foreign Ministry, he set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division and led it for 8 years. He has served as India's first ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and later as ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. After retiring in 2013, Ambassador Sood was PM Special Envoy for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation till May 2014. Now, before I hand over the proceeding of today's roundtable discussion to the chair, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. Each expert will have 12 to 14 minutes for their opening remarks, after which the chair will open the floor to audience questions. Now, to raise a question, participants can type their queries in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please mention who your query is addressed to. Alternatively, you can click the raise hand icon, and I will bring you on the screen during the Q&A round. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you very much. Let me just also add my words of welcome to everybody on behalf of CSDR for joining us for what is a very important subject, and I think it's a very illustrious panel that we have today. As you know, each of you will have about 10 to 12 minutes, and after that we'll move into the wider session involving the audience. Now, you've gone through in the email that Gaurav sent. I think he has set out the kind of questions that we are looking at. And I would just like to elaborate it a little more in terms of some of the other nuances that perhaps we could look at. One of those that I think, since we are looking at nuclear risks in Asia, I think it is important to reflect a little bit on how the geopolitical change from Euro-Atlantic to Asia has changed nuclear threat perceptions. if it has, because there was a certain bipolar nuclear order that existed, and that, in a sense, uh, determined how the world looked at deterrence and how the world looked at arms control and so on. And when you look at Asia, some of those elements of bipolarity tend to break down. I am, now this is a counterfactual, but I'm absolutely certain that had the first nuclear age been taking place in Asia, I think our whole approach to what we would have learned about arms control and deterrence theories and things like that may have been quite different. But anyway, because if we look at it, you know, arms control, when it first emerged, it was more of crisis management, and then gradually becomes evolved into an arms race management with various bilateral treaties and so on. And then it added on non-proliferation issues and things like that. So how in Asia, when you move away from bipolarity, how does asymmetry, both in terms of sizes of arsenals of the people, of the countries involved, as well as levels of technological development, certain countries pursuing ballistic missile defense capabilities, certain countries pursuing hypersonics and things like that. How does all this impact on our title, which is nuclear risks? Because I think we have to factor all these in to be able to determine the nuclear risks that we seek to see in Asia. I think with General Amit Sharma, perhaps, I mean, one of the things that it has often I have thought about is that while in conventional terms, India always talks of a two-front war, and recently we have seen this two-front war being articulated repeatedly. Given the fact that we see a close China-Pakistan relationship, when we look at nuclear domain, is it valid to look at India's situation in terms of a two-front war, or should it actually be one front? I do not know how you see it, but given the fact that you have headed the Strategic Force Command and also had other senior responsibilities, I mean, it would be interesting to perhaps dwell a little on this. And finally, what does all this imply for measures of mitigating nuclear risk? I mean, I take it as a given that we are not going to see nuclear disarmament in the foreseeable future. So what we have to look at, once we look at the risk is and analyze it, then I think we also need to look at what are the possible measures that we can employ to mitigate nuclear risk. So with that, let me start off by inviting our first speaker, Toby Dalton. Toby, you have the floor.
Well, great, Ambassador Sood, it's great to see you, great to see colleagues on the screen, and my thanks to CSDR for inviting me to join this discussion today. So we've been given several prompts, and the first of those pertains to nuclear balance, and in my view, that's a good place to start. And so in my remarks, I wanted to question the relevance of nuclear balance to risks and security in Southern Asia today. I figured it'd be easy to start with a few assumptions, maybe give a slightly simplistic snapshot as I understand the situation of nuclear balance based on publicly available information. Starting with China. So China is modernizing its nuclear forces. Its arsenal is growing. According to US estimates, it's maybe in the low 200s now in terms of numbers of warheads, projected by the US intelligence community to double in the coming years. It's fielding more ICBMs, it's fielding more nuclear-powered submarines that would carry submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and also highly accurate medium-range systems. And these are the systems that capture considerable attention in the US in terms of contingencies in East Asia. The regional Chinese missile threat has long been significant, But I think in terms of Southern Asia, the extent to which Chinese nuclear forces are postured for deterrence to the south is less clear in my mind. India is also modernizing its nuclear forces, particularly in the delivery vehicle area. Question mark here is whether the arsenal is growing along with new systems coming in. Public estimates from US analysts suggest perhaps India has about 150 warheads. Obviously, you all would know better. Deliberately paced build out of the triad continues with emphasis on longer range and perhaps also MIRV missiles in the future. Some questions here also about the shorter range and older systems, and also what the future operations of the SSBN force would look like. And then in Pakistan, I think the modernization that it's been going through over the last 10 to 15 years may be plateauing after a heavy period of development and testing. Question also about the size of the arsenal. The last estimate from Hans Christensen and company, which is kind of, they're the go-to people here in Washington for public estimates. They say maybe 140 to 150 warheads in Pakistan. Maybe it's bigger at this point. That was in 2018. Questions about the sea leg and cruise missiles, also about whether some missiles will be MIRVed and the range, and whether it would extend beyond the requirements of India's specific deterrence. So that's a quick snapshot of what the nuclear balance appears to be. So looking only at numbers and capabilities, do we see major shifts or any critical disparities that create new or different instabilities? Numbers haven't really changed much, or in ways that would seem to matter to decision makers in the region. We haven't seen a spike in production or reports of a massive increase in arsenal sizes. It's been seemingly very steady. And it seems like it would require perhaps an order of magnitude change, at least in terms of numbers, to undermine credible deterrence. But let me put some question marks here. MIRVing, I think, is one of those question marks, right? It's a very important technology, and it could take hold in more systems, and it could impact the actual or perceived balance, especially if it drives up warhead requirements. And then the question that follows from that is what it buys for states in terms of deterrence. In my view, the value proposition versus the instability risks of MIRVing is poor. But obviously my view is not the one that counts in terms of decisions on MIRV capabilities going forward. Anyway, numbers aren't everything in terms of nuclear balance. So I offer this as kind of an outsider's perspective and recognize that perceptions in the region are the more important consideration here, obviously. There was a lot of concern and writing and perhaps even a little heavy breathing about the development of counterforce capabilities in the India-Pakistan context before, but then especially after the Pulwama-Balakot crisis in 2019. I could also say that there appears to be some concern in Pakistan that Prime Minister Modi is not as rational in his risk propensity in crisis decision-making. And so perhaps these point to ideational changes that matter more in terms of perceptions of nuclear balance than the actual numbers or capabilities themselves. Yet, at least between India and Pakistan, since February of 2019, there is little to indicate that there's some new instability that is related to nuclear forces. And if anything, it kind of looks like the same old normal, right? There's not a lot to really suggest that the nuclear balance is relevant to changes in India-Pakistan relations. What about China-India and the balance there? So the arsenal sizes are different. So at some level there is an imbalance as China remains further ahead in numbers and variety of delivery systems. But, and I think this is the key part, my perception and understanding is that nuclear weapons really only operate at kind of the level of general deterrence in China-India relations. So the numbers or even the perceptions of the balance don't really matter that much today. It's not like people in Beijing believe that India's nuclear forces aren't survivable or therefore it should attempt a disarming first strike. That doesn't appear to be Chinese nuclear thinking about nuclear forces or deterrence or about India for that matter. So I think that the nuclear balance just is not as critical an issue in the challenges facing China and India and their relationship. So interesting question here is whether perceptions of nuclear balance are actually more influenced at this point by non-nuclear strategic capability development, and then specifically looking at ballistic missile defenses and or anti-satellite capabilities. It appears that in Pakistan, concerns about India's ballistic missile development program have shaped thinking about delivery options, including cruise missiles, or at least some people in Pakistan point to BMD in India to justify those capabilities. And combined with the counterforce rhetoric and writings, one could see why this is the case in Pakistan. And perhaps General Sharma will comment on this, but some prominent retired Indian military officers with previous experience in the Strategic Forces Command have written and argued for these kinds of capabilities in India and posture for that matter. India and China, again, do not have a specific or well-defined nuclear deterrence relationship, in my view. In a study last year on Chinese views about China-India nuclear relations, my colleague Tong Zhao and I interviewed quite a few Chinese experts, and our sense that we came away with was that there was something like a decoupled deterrence, right? That both states are exercising deterrence and using nuclear weapons for those purposes, but in their bilateral relations, it just really isn't as paramount. So BMD and ASAT are relevant capabilities, but as yet don't seem to affect perceptions of the efficacy of nuclear weapons as it contributes to general deterrence. And my guess is that there's now some kind of mutual understanding about the vulnerability of satellites and probably a desire to really not go there in a conflict, right? That would be a major qualitative change and escalation in a future conflict. And as much as the threat to do that exists, that's probably sufficient at this point. If modernization programs involve changes to nuclear command and control architecture and more what my colleague James Acton has termed entanglement of nuclear and non-nuclear systems, then you could see more dynamic risks in the future in crises, to the extent that perceptions of nuclear balance are affected by the desirability of targeting things that may have conventional roles as well as nuclear roles. In this regard, I just want to point out that dual capable delivery systems are a pretty notable feature of the nuclear landscape in Southern Asia. I think according to many Western analysts who have studied this issue, the problems associated with dual capability are the ambiguity that it creates both pre and post launch, and the role that ambiguity plays in crisis stability, which is probably not good. Recent stories about the planning around the purported Indian threat to fire missiles at Pakistan, for instance, during the 2019 crisis are indicative. The story suggested that India was readying Prithvis, or at least that was the threat. And given that Prithvis had assumed to have a nuclear role, shouldn't have Pakistan assumed that they were nuclear? That's an interesting question there. So understand that this ambiguity may be seen by participants in the region as a feature and not a bug. And I'm just observing that that may not be all good. It carries real risks, even if dual capability is more efficient and may have some perceived deterrence benefits. So to quickly recap and then to address a couple other questions. So has the balance shifted in important ways? Perhaps qualitatively or in terms of ideas, but not in ways that exacerbate risks of deterrence failure or crisis instability in my mind. Are there trends to be concerned about? For sure. I think non-nuclear capabilities and dual capable missiles could change perceptions of the deterrence balance, especially if some in the region view an adversary's capabilities through the prism of trying to escape deterrence. Now, a question then about the direction of China-India relations in this regard. And this gets to the point that Ambassador Sood made about the kind of broader geopolitical context with China. Could nuclear weapons become more salient in that relationship in the future? And obviously that would be a significant change. I guess in my view, I don't see this as a likely proposition. India and China seem to have good reason to manage competition and cooperation in a way that continues to place nuclear weapons in the realm of general deterrence rather than playing more specific roles. Perhaps border skirmishing continues, it could even be more violent in the future, but that doesn't necessarily portend a limited conflict that would carry with it the escalation risks that would then bring nuclear weapons into play. That said, leaders are obviously very independent and sometimes unpredictable variables in these equations, and both Prime Minister Modi and Xi in China have cultivated images of being strong leaders. And so that probably creates some upward pressure during crisis. And it's possible that you could see miscalculation of the others' resolve. And then just a closing thought, and I'm curious for views from the other panelists. What role, if any, do you think that nuclear weapons have played, if any, as I say, in reaching the current LOC ceasefire? I think there could be a view that if you look at the world through the prism of deterrence, there's a temptation to see that ceasefire as perhaps indicative of some sort of stalemate. I don't think that's actually the case. I assume it's more indicative of domestic politics, but I would really appreciate and welcome views from others on the panel. So with that, I will wrap up and look to the remarks of others. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Toby. Thanks a lot. Let me now move to Manpreet. Manpreet, over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. And I hope my presentation is visible. Just flash that up. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Happymon, for having me. Very glad to see the kind of work that the newly created center has started doing. And I'm particularly honored to be a part of this session, which, with such knowledgeable co-panelists and chair with me. Very pointed and relevant questions were raised in the email, which was mentioned earlier, and they do spawn a large range of issues. What I've tried to do is to club them into essentially three dimensions. So I'm looking at the nuclear risks in Southern Asia and why they are different from what we've been used to during the Cold War. What are some of the doctrinal issues? Because this was also raised several times in those questions. And thirdly, the prospects of arms control given the nature of the relationship and the nuclear dynamics in this region. So coming then to the nuclear risks in Southern Asia, and I don't need to go over them in a very elaborate fashion because we all understand what these are, and Toby sort of made my job easier by actually giving us a very good snapshot of what's going on in the region. So what we have here are three geographically contiguous nuclear powers with unresolved territorial disputes. We are not just looking at border issues, we are looking at territories which are claimed by others in the case of India. This amounts to having two adversarial dyads, India-China, India-Pakistan, one iron brother relationship between China and Pakistan, one triangle in the region, and one quadrangle, because what the US does has an impact on how China reacts to it, and that has a downstream impact then on India and Pakistan. So what you see here is not just bipolar in terms of having two adversarial dyads, but you've got several kinds of geometric designs working themselves out in the region. All of this leads us to a chain conundrum, because what happens at the highest level filters down to the lowest level in terms of capability build-up. We have these four countries with different doctrines and different levels of capabilities. Each one is perched at a different level of capability, trying to find its own way on what is credible deterrence for themselves. There are differences in the practice of deterrence, entanglement, ambiguity, this was mentioned, and the manner in which how a country is establishing the practice of deterrence is very different amongst all of them. We see the use of terrorism as a tool, which is an absolutely different phenomenon from anywhere else that we've seen between nuclear weapon states. And therefore, the risk of nuclear escalation, especially inadvertent. I think deliberate nuclear war, highly unlikely between any of them, given that there is an understanding of what nuclear weapons are meant for. But the possibility of stumbling into a nuclear war, inadvertence, and I'll talk about what are some of the factors that are going to add to the problems of inadvertence in the future. So this is where I find the risks in Southern Asia. Some of the visible regional nuclear weapon trends are: one, warhead inventory buildup. No, it hasn't accelerated or become as exaggerated as the US thought in the case of China. And also in the case of India and Pakistan, it's been a steady buildup. So we've gone up by, say, 10 nuclear warheads every year. And this is all going by information which is not officially corroborated, but from what we understand from the various sources that bring out numbers. There are improvements in missile ranges, in accuracy and reliability of missiles in all of the three countries in the region. There is a focus on arsenal survivability. So mobility of missiles, moving on from liquid fuel to solid fuel missiles. There is a dispersal of the nuclear warheads across platforms. So land, sea, air, all three of them are dispersing them across platforms. And there is a focus on penetrability, especially in the case of China, because it looks at the US ballistic missile defense as a major erosion of its own nuclear deterrence, and therefore the need for more and more penetrable missiles. And therefore MIRVed and MARVed missiles both come into the picture, and they create a problem for the rest of the region. We also see cruise missile proliferation. And again, across the spectrum, across the three countries, even though in the case of India, cruise missiles have not been declared nuclear capable. But in the case of the other two, there is a dual role for some of the cruise missiles. There is a growing asymmetry of capabilities, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of capabilities. There is a growing asymmetry, and that does impact nuclear deterrence. Now, some of this asymmetry in some of the capabilities, I think, matters less. So if it was in the case of, for instance, SSBNs or tunnels or mobility, which are essentially to ensure survivability of deterrence, I think those issues matter less than these others that I've listed here. So ballistic missile defense, or the perception that there is going to be an effective ballistic missile defense and related infrastructure, does matter. And here I'm referring to early warning, ISR capabilities, etc., which does impact deterrence. MIRVing and MARVing of missiles and hypersonics, it does affect your perceptions. Space-based capability to increase missile accuracy, and increased ambiguity through dual use and co-location of missiles. All of these add to the problem that we are looking at. China's strategic modernization may be with an eye at the US, but there is a downstream impact, because every time I've been in a discussion with the Chinese scholars, there is a tendency to say, but India doesn't need to bother because we are stable and we don't have to worry about the nuclear capability. But unfortunately, capability buildup does bother you when you have unresolved territorial disputes with the other side, and you are unsure of the intentions, especially after 2020. Now, in my second category, I'm looking at the doctrinal issues. All the three countries started with the idea of credible minimum deterrence. Even in the case of China, even though it was attributed by the Americans to the Chinese, but we've seen that they have essentially remained with that philosophy of numbers not mattering as much, and therefore there is credible minimum deterrence. Now, Pakistan has already declared that it has moved on to full spectrum deterrence. So all types of warheads and ranges of missiles to meet every contingency from subconventional to nuclear. There is a projection of nuclear brinkmanship that you see more and more in the statements which are made at the highest level. And essentially it is the role of the weapon is to deter conventional action. In the case of China and India, and I think Toby referred to that there is a doctrinal consonance for sure. So there is a similar understanding of the role of nuclear weapons, which is supposed to be essentially sole purpose, meant for nuclear weapons used from the other side. The focus is on sufficient numbers to cause unacceptable damage, and it's only for nuclear retaliation. So no first use is a declaratory policy that both of them come up with. But the advancing technological capabilities, how is that going to impact the doctrine? Development of MIRV missiles and BMD. What does that do to NFU? Because these are essentially seen as first strike weapons, and BMD is when your ease of doing first strike and then protecting yourself. So how does that impact NFU? Development of early warning systems in China, where there have been reports that with Russian help, they are looking at early warning. would that mean a shift from their low alert levels to launch under attack or launch on warning? And some of the statements that have been made on NFU in India and in China are open to multiple interpretations. And we've particularly seen, they being picked up by people across who have then sensed the possibility of a change in doctrine, especially in the dimension of no first use. Now, there are these rumblings of discontent that you hear even within the country, where there's a feeling that NFU puts you on the defensive, that it reflects passivity on the part of the government, that it allows Pakistan to take us for a ride because we are suggesting not to be the first to use nuclear weapons. And it reduces our threat potential to China because that can rest easy that the weapons are not coming into use. And therefore, the general perception that it puts India at a disadvantage because you are accepting the idea of large-scale destruction and you are ceding the military initiative. But actually, if you look at the military logic of no first use, nuclear first use is not a good idea when the adversary has a secure second strike capability. And the point that I was making on how all three of them are working on survivability of their arsenal, they're actually having a secure second strike capability. So there is no possibility of a splendid first strike, which could be disarming or decapitating. And therefore, there is no guarantee that there will not be escalation. So nuclear offense cannot assure victory. And how does one come out looking better after using a nuclear weapon first in a scenario when you are going to get assured retaliation from the other side? So therefore, what I'm trying to point out is that there is a military logic of NFU. A few political statements made in a certain context don't essentially amount to the fact that there is going to be a removal of NFU because of the deeper understanding of what the NFU does. It also reduces your requirements of credible first use, and it increases the risks. Look at some of the requirements of a credible first use, because nuclear deterrence is all about credibility. You would need readiness for preemption with hair trigger alert postures, high sophistication of command control communications intelligence, and a large arsenal with counterforce capability. And it increases your problems and your risks because the control over weapons is on high alert. There is a pressure on the adversary of use or lose. It adds to your costs, especially miscalculation and accident, and it actually increases the risk of nuclear exchange. Given this understanding, the NFU, I think, is going to stay in both China and India. And NFU is more credible and liberating. It's actually not putting the weight of first use on yourself. And there is a weight to carry when you have to take a decision like that. You're leaving the onus of escalation on the adversary, and the decision to retaliate could be far easier, legitimate, and guilt-free than the first use that you would be thinking about. So the NFU, to my mind, brings crisis stability, arms race stability, and it reduces the risk of inadvertent escalation, bringing back some of the balance which is upset by the asymmetry in capabilities. Is ambiguous doctrine an answer? Because, Toby raised this point about some of the retired military men saying whether we should move to ambiguity rather than have this clarity indicated through the NFU, that you could apply it in certain situations. But I think all that you end up doing is complicating the definition of red lines, which in the case of NFU is very clear in terms of when the weapon will come into play. By heightening the risk of misperception and inadvertent escalation, you're actually adding to your own worries if you were to move towards ambiguity. And there are better conventional ways of handling the military contingencies. My last slide is on the prospects of nuclear arms control in Southern Asia. And I think we would all echo the same skepticism about them, because I do think they are dim, because the prerequisites for a nuclear arms control are missing. There is no mutual desire for strategic stability. In fact, we find in the case of Pakistan versus India and in the case of China versus the US, there is a belief that instability or ambiguity actually enhances deterrence. So there is no desire to have that strategic stability at the nuclear level, because then you can't indulge in some of the so-called deterrence enhancing activities. There is no acceptance of arms control as a worthwhile objective by national leaderships. Ambassador Sood pointed out in the beginning, each one of these three countries has a different perception of arms control. So India has seen it as technology denial, or something which was crisis management or arms race management. So that understanding that nuclear arms control in our case now will be helpful for crisis management and arms race management has still not sunk in, and there is no desire on the part of the leadership to move in this direction. There is no readiness to invest in risky negotiations or decision making. Even when the ceasefire was announced, there were enough views that came out about whether this was a good path to follow. So there is, the political climate doesn't allow you to get into this very easily. But I do believe that if there is change at the global level, if there was some kind of strategic stability talks, even dialogue between US, Russia, US, China, or the three of them together, that would be beneficial also for the region in terms of changing perceptions on what arms control is all about. A very rich menu of questions was presented to us, and I've tried to pick out some of them and club them into this little basket that I've put out before you. Thank you so much, Chair, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Manpreet. May I now give the floor to Hannah? Hannah, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sood. It's definitely an honor to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion. My thanks to the CSDR team for pulling it together and inviting me to join, and to my co-panelists for their really thoughtful remarks. I've got a couple pages of notes already. I think that the questions Toby and Manpreet and I have been referring to that this roundtable are centered around, they're pretty important ones, and I think the answers to them will define security dynamics in Asia for the foreseeable future. I'm going to limit myself to speaking to the ones that, as an observer sitting in the United States, I have some insight on, and I look forward to learning from our Indian colleagues on the others. First, it's important for me to clarify that I am speaking in my capacity as a researcher, and that none of my remarks are necessarily representative of the positions or policies of the United States government, the US Department of Energy, or India National Laboratories. And with that, I think a lot of the things I want to say are echoed in what Toby and Manpreet have said, but maybe from a different approach. So it's clear to me that arms control, norm building, and risk reduction are priorities for the new US administration, at least. I agree with today's roundtable organizers that hypersonic systems, naval systems, ballistic missile defense systems, and offensive cyber capabilities are some of the key regional developments underway that could threaten stability. Others, I think, worth considering, particularly in the near term, in terms of implications for stability, are armed and unarmed drones, and then the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance implications of satellites and anti-satellite offensive capabilities. I'm encouraged to see that President Biden's administration has already emphasized that it will continue and grow US efforts to address how the developments in cyber and emerging technologies impact US national security interests, and to work to define global norms in these evolving domains. Recent events indicate that all states, including the United States, are vulnerable to offensive cyber activities, together with related disinformation challenges, particularly during crisis decision-making windows. The US-India strategic partnership, bilaterally, but also through unique initiatives like the Quad, which I know many of us are following with excitement, is clearly a major priority for this administration to bolster stability in Asia and to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. And right out of the gates, starting with his confirmation process at the US Senate, Secretary of Defense Austin highlighted US concerns over escalation after the Pulwama-Balakot crisis in 2019, the importance of enhancing regional stability broadly, and of bolstering US relations with both India and Pakistan's militaries. So from the US side, I feel like there is policy will to address threats to stability in Asia, like those identified in these roundtable questions. The question to me is whether there is space and political will for cooperative engagement on these issues in Asia, and what are the approaches that are most likely to succeed. The dynamism of the Indo-Pacific and broader Southern Asia region, with 4 nuclear armed states regularly projecting power in overlapping and evolving domains, poses novel escalation risks. I think we've heard a little bit about these from both Toby and Manpreet. Future interstate crises in the region during what some analysts are calling the third nuclear age will involve unfamiliar, multipolar, and I think probably multi-domain dynamics. A future US-China, China-India, or India-Pakistan crisis will impact the interests of and potentially draw in as a crisis actor the other 2 states in this unique foursome. And the resulting challenges to strategic stability, I do think merit new research and dialogue on prospects for cooperative security and crisis prevention. So the first question for this panel asked us to assess shifts in the nuclear balance in Southern Asia. I think probably mostly in agreement with Toby that I would argue that the basic structure hasn't really changed. Like much of the world, Southern Asia and the Indo-Pacific is impacted by strategic competition between the United States and China. However, it's the only region where this competition is complicated by 2 other nuclear dyads, both characterized by recurring interstate crises, India-Pakistan and India-China. The deterrent postures and strategic objectives of the 4 key nuclear armed states operating in the Indo-Pacific have asymmetric effects on one another. So in the way that Manpreet described, using a different phrase, I would submit that Einhorn and Sidhu's concept of the strategic chain linking the nuclear deterrence of the United States, China, India, and Pakistan still hold. What I think has shifted lately is China-India and US-India relations. The United States and India are much closer, strategically aligned partners than they previously were, and recent border and other crises highlight how the growing tension in the relationship between Beijing and New Delhi is affecting stability. As India responds to both China's and Pakistan's growing military capabilities, I, in my former capacity as a think tank researcher and others, have argued that it seems that India is working to expand its conventional options during interstate crises below the nuclear threshold. And I think that's where some of these adoptions of newer capabilities, both conventional and dual use, becomes more relevant. We saw some of this stretching, if you will, happen during the Balakot-Pulwama crisis in early 2019, where historically novel escalation took place as India and Pakistan exchanged airstrikes on one another's own territories. This may reflect potential doctrinal or strategic shifts identified by scholars who take a different view than Manpreet, I think, including Vipin Narang and Chris Clary, on India's approach to no first use possibly shifting and counterforce strategies being considered. Only India's current national security leadership can speak authoritatively on the veracity of those potential developments. Overall, however, these regional trends to me suggest that we have underexplored dynamics at play that are going to impact stability broadly, but also future crises. So one aspect of these topics that my colleagues and I spend time thinking about is the regionally specific implications of how the asymmetry in this triad impacts blurry red lines, signaling attempts, definitions of a proportional response, and then prospects broadly for crisis prevention and crisis management. So for example, something I'm curious about is, what happens to Pakistan's operational and strategic calculi if, in a really simple example, India were to deploy a modified IAI Heron medium altitude, long endurance UAV on the line of control during a crisis. Just throwing that out there as an idea. Does the use of a drone modified to carry conventional munitions instead of typical cross-border firing that we're used to during crises, is that somehow inherently more destabilizing because it's a technology and military capability that India is adopting at a faster rate than Pakistan, for example? Similarly, could we envision a crisis where one state destroys another's satellites for signaling reasons? Toby kind of dismissed this idea as not super helpful. I would agree, because I don't think it's stabilizing, but I could envision a scenario where you might use a demonstration of your ASAT capability to send a signal of your seriousness during a crisis. So what does that use of a newer capability mean for stability? I'm not sure. And more specifically, what does a proportional response look like if your adversary takes such a step? What is clear to me is that these developments in military capabilities of India, Pakistan, and China, as they continue, that we're going to need new bilateral and multilateral mechanisms to reduce the likelihood of inadvertent escalation. So as the South Asia lead for Sandia National Laboratory, CMC, I'm primarily interested in not just exploring how these developments in nuclear Asia may complicate escalation dynamics, but also how can the United States, India, and other regional parties, how can we work together to reduce shared risks and bolster cooperative security? And specifically, how can technologies and science diplomacy support that process? So as Chinese economic and geopolitical investments in the Indo-Pacific expand, I would push back a little bit against Manpreet's closing argument about there being built-in commitments to instability being useful for deterrent postures. I would say that as China and India's roles are growing, and China in particular, that their incentives, their national interests are increasingly served by promotion of norms that prevent militarized interstate crises. This risk aversion, coupled with enduring US interests in the region and India and Pakistan's own historical stakes, can be potentially a productive common ground for all parties to work together to prevent inadvertent escalation in the future. So in that vein, I'd like to quickly spend a little time addressing the broader context of risk reduction that backstops and likely will have to precede this roundtable specific question on prospects for regional arms control and disarmament agreements. And this is where hopefully my comments will add something instead of just repeating what my more experienced colleagues have already said. I think that crises are defined by their unpredictability, forcing participants to operate in this realm of risk and uncertainty that Thomas Schelling and others have articulated over the years. Risk reduction across the onset, escalation, and termination of a nuclearized interstate crisis entails lessening that unpredictability and uncertainty about risks. Simplified, to me, risk reduction mechanisms can be broken into three categories. So first, you have mechanisms for communication before, during, and after a crisis that states use to send signals and clarify intentions. Second, there are mechanisms of restraint where states acknowledging their shared risks and resulting mutual vulnerability voluntarily commit to actions that restrain their capabilities or their action. And third, there are transparency mechanisms, which I know isn't the most popular word in India, but I don't have a better synonym. And that's where states voluntarily divulge information to reduce uncertainty, whether unilaterally or cooperatively, and with or without the means for monitoring and verification. The US and Russia, I think, are an interesting historical backdrop, and I would agree with you, Ambassador Sood, that a major challenge for arms control and far before that for crisis prevention and risk management in Southern Asia is that we're looking at a different historical context than the Cold War, and we're also looking at actors that approach the concept of arms control and risk reduction very differently. But we do have this historical example, right, of the United States and Russia having centers that are aimed at crisis prevention through communication and transparency mechanisms. This model might be useful elsewhere in similar or perhaps very distinct ways. For example, there are bilateral missile test notification regimes between Russia and China and the United States and Russia and India and Pakistan. There have been proposals from scholars like, I think the latest I've read was from Frank O'Donnell, that have advocated a more multilateral missile test notification regime that would include India, Pakistan, and China. A bilateral India-China mechanism on missile tests might be a useful place to start. Perhaps various bilateral CBMs could then be built out into multilateral crisis prevention mechanisms one day through something like a test pre-notification regime. Similarly, China might be enticed to join in or cooperatively expand existing India-Pakistan mechanisms. You could start with really low-hanging fruit, like the agreement on the prohibition of attack against nuclear installations, for example. And then I know Toby's work at Carnegie and some of his colleagues there, as well as work done at the Stimson Center by people like Michael Crapon in his Off-Ramps book, I think are good resources for thinking about what arms control and risk reduction could look like in a Southern Asian context. Regional asymmetry in Southern Asia and in the broader Indo-Pacific suggests to me that comprehensive multilateral arms control is a ways off. So I would agree with my other panelists on that. But I do think there are near and medium term risk reduction steps and conversations, as Manpreet highlighted, high-level dialogues that could help lay the groundwork for brokering future agreements. And I know panelists are supposed to offer assessments, but like Toby, I'd love to end with 1 or 2 questions here in hopes that perhaps some others will address them during today's discussion. One thing that Manpreet touched on, but didn't go into a lot of details on, is this struggle of how do you deal with terrorism in a highly nuclearized environment. So one question I have, particularly with the adoption of emerging military capabilities that are enhanced perhaps by cyber capabilities, is how can we assess how non-state actors directly interfacing with emerging technologies and newer military capabilities in Southern Asia might impact communication, information flow, or defensive or offensive state actions? And then another one I just want to throw out there is, what are the main differences in national perspectives on how to approach arms control, or even how to approach a common understanding of risk? And I'll sort of end quickly here with something that Toby's colleague Tong Zhao said at one of my events yesterday, where we were discussing some similar questions. He made a really insightful and discouraging point that a major hurdle to arms control and risk reduction in Southern Asia right now is that these states, these 4 countries and the others around them, are not all on the same page in terms of understanding escalation risks. So we're coming at even our perception of the need differently, as well as not understanding one another's threat perceptions and how that'll affect anything cooperative. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Ambassador Sood.
Thank you, Anna. Interesting questions. Let me now hand over to General Amit Sharma. Amit, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be in such a fantastic group of speakers. Ambassador Sood mentioned that would I like to have the last word, but from what everybody else has spoken, there's actually nothing much left to speak. So what I'll do is I'll digress from what I had prepared and planned to speak earlier, and I'll address certain issues that have come up in today's discussions and raise certain questions and give my thoughts on those. Firstly, before I want to start off with, I'd like to say that what is important to understand is the psychology of India as to why we are nuclear and why are we behaving the way we are behaving. India, as we all know, went nuclear in 1998, despite having the capability of doing so earlier. This was purely because we did not believe that nuclear weapons bring any good. We've always felt, and we feel even today, that nuclear weapons bring only devastation and are not for war fighting.
General Sharma, we can't see you. Can you turn on your video?
Sorry?
We can't see you. Can you turn on your video?
Sorry, can you see me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, happy. So what I said is that we went nuclear purely for reasons of national security and not for prestige or for having power. And therefore, our doctrine was of no first use and credible minimum deterrence. Now, I'll explain to you, and what Manpreet also said, the NFU is what we started off in 1998 and 2003. And NFU is something that we maintain even today because we feel that that is the only way forward. Now, security and development are 2 sides of the same coin. And India, as we all know, is a developing country where over 60% of our population is below 30 or 35 years of age. So our focus today is on education, getting jobs for people, health, and industrial development to become Atmanirbhar, as we say, or self-reliant. But at the same time, security and development, like I said, are 2 sides of the same coin. Without security, there cannot be any development, and development without security is of no use. So that is why, unfortunately, because of our geographical region and our 2 neighbors on either side, we have to focus on security if we want to develop. So that is why we stand. Now, we've had problems with Pakistan and China for ages, and that is why in 1998, we felt that by 87, Pakistan was nuclear, and 64, China was nuclear. We had no option but to go in for nuclear weapons if we were to prevent being blackmailed or coerced by China or Pakistan. Now, that is the psychology of the country that is there even today. We firmly believe, one, that nuclear weapons are not for war fighting, they are only for deterrence. And two, for deterring any country from using nuclear weapons against us. And like Manpreet brought out, NFU is not a good boy kind of a thing. It makes military sense also. If we study what President Biden has just said, if we analyze as to how the Cuban crisis was diffused, if we see what Russia is talking about today, we all feel that everybody realizes that a nuclear war cannot be fought and won. It only brings devastation. And that is why an NFU, our stand is that unless we are attacked, we will not attack. But we must have credible strength to ensure a credible second strike capability. And that is what will lead to strategic deterrence. Ambassador Sood brought out a point. He wanted me to speak on China and Pakistan and a two-front scenario. We have been facing a two, in fact, not just a 2.5 front scenario, a 0.5 being the terrorism emanating from Pakistan. And as we saw in the last standoff with China, India is prepared for a 2.5 front confrontation with our two neighbors. Now, the point comes for nuclear aspect. Now, deterrence can only be brought about if the other side knows that we are capable of hitting back and hitting back hard. And that leads to a force structuring. Therefore, with China being a nuclear weapon power, and so is Pakistan, I guess if we have to have a credible minimum deterrence posture, we should have the capability of inflicting damage on either of the two countries or both if required. God forbid. I cannot imagine such a scenario of a two-front nuclear war. It can only, I think, bring devastation to the entire subcontinent and China, of course. But I guess to ensure strategic deterrence, our force structuring has to be such that we are capable of doing what our doctrine says is massive retaliation after absorbing a first strike. The problem is further compounded because China does not consider India to be a nuclear weapon power. And its development is based on the United States. With the US developing its weapons and modernizing, China is trying to do the same. Now, willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, to keep pace with a posture of minimum deterrence against China also, we too have to expand and modernize. Now, once we do that, Pakistan jumps into the fray and they say they have to modernize too. Unfortunately, it's a vicious circle. There's nothing that anybody can do about it. So I guess India has no option but to keep track of the modernization of our neighbors and modernize and expand accordingly. A point came up about MIRVs and having this capability, would it lead to a capability for first strike and insecurity? Yes, it would. Having precision weapons does create a fear of a first strike and counter force. But I guess the way we look at it, you must have good enough and modern weapons to carry out a second strike capability also. So if we go in for MIRV, which I personally feel we should go in for counter-strike systems, we should go in for modern systems, but that is not to be capable of carrying out a first strike. We do not believe in a first strike. That is only to ensure that we have a credible minimum deterrence posture to make it clear to our adversaries that in case we are hit first, we maintain the capability of massive retaliation. So that is how we stand, and that is how we look at it. Manpreet touched upon NFU ambiguity and the posture, and what Toby mentioned that some of my predecessors have possibly spoken about it. My personal opinion is that we should not leave anything in the nuclear domain to ambiguity. Our doctrine is very clear-cut. The 8 points are very specific and clear. And I fully say that we must be very clear because you're not playing around. In conventional war, ambiguity is useful. In conventional war, you've got to keep the enemy guessing as to what you have and what you're going to do. But nuclear war doesn't work like that because we really do not want to get into a nuclear war. So I feel we must be clear-cut. There should be absolutely no ambiguity. Our postures which are defined today are not changing. NFU is there, and I feel it is there to stay. There is no need for ambiguity, because ambiguity leads to uncertainty, which leads to strategic instability. And what we want is strategic stability. Therefore, we must be absolutely unambiguous and clear. NFU is a posture, and NFU is a posture which India must maintain. We now come to certain points which were raised by the previous speakers. Like I said, I'll diverse from my original script and not repeat anything. A point about deployment of Prithvis, and a point about the irrationality of a prime minister in Uri and Balakot. Frankly, I retired a number of years back, so I really wouldn't know what the deployments would be. But friends, I can very confidently say that Prithvis was not deployed, because Prithvis are nuclear weapons. India does not believe in dual-use weapons, and we've clearly said our ballistic missiles are nuclear and our cruise missiles are conventional. We do not mix the two. So if at all, if any missiles were deployed, it must have been the cruise missile, which is understandable, because cruise missiles are meant only for conventional weapons. And so there was no chance of a nuclear first strike by India. Pakistan does have a habit of crying wolf every time. Now, what are the nuclear red lines? When the United Nations, you say that we are two nuclear weapon powers, it conveys a lot. When the chief of the army staff is talking about peace, he mentions peace between two nuclear weapon powers. Now, that's a very loaded statement. We understand that we are nuclear weapon powers, and we also understand that not just India, but Pakistan hierarchy is also a professional army, and they are mature. There is a difference between talking, and there's a difference between understanding what the consequences of a nuclear exchange can be. And I'm sure that my friends across in Pakistan do understand the consequences of a nuclear exchange. And the consequences as well, nothing, no rocket science, it is devastating and destruction. So I'm sure that they do understand, and they will not do something foolish as even using tactical nuclear weapons if and when required to do so. A point about the irrationality of the Prime Minister that was brought about. All I'd like to say is that I feel there was nothing irrational about it. It was just a demonstration of a political will to say that today we are in a position to be offensive. And if we are pushed and a push comes to a shove, we will respond in a strong manner. The fact that we have not done so till today, whether it was in the Mumbai blast of '93, in the Mumbai attack in 2008, even in 1999, we kept it confined to a political area. And even thereafter, we have not taken any actions. But now I feel the mood of the country and the attitude is the right, that if we are hit, we have no option but to hit back. And I can assure you that I think it's common sense that all of us realize that if the government took a step of using the Air Force in the second instance, I'm sure they were prepared for what could happen thereafter. And by that, I mean not a nuclear exchange, an expansion in the conventional domain, which I feel if it happens, I guess we are prepared for. The last point is about what Hannah brought about arms control and terrorism. I think all of us are clear that terrorism, or agree on the point that terrorism is one thing that is a basic problem. Pakistan has got caught into a quagmire by, supporting state-sponsored terrorism. I think that is the basic thing, whether through diplomatic means, I will not say military is the last means, financial means or otherwise, this has to be rectified. And once that is done, I guess things would be better. It's a very tough call, it's very simple to say, but I guess if terrorism continues, it will create instability in the region. And last point about arms control, I wish we could do something about it. But in this region, at least, between China, Pakistan, and India, I think that's the last question, which says about how distant are the prospects of armed controls and disarmament in the three countries. I think it's, at the moment, it's a dream, because China is looking at the United States. Their development, their expansion, their weapons are all directed to be a global power. They're not looking just at India. India has to look at China and plan accordingly and expand accordingly. Pakistan looks at both and then expand. So I feel it's a vicious circle at the moment. For the moment, disarmament, I think, is not possible. India is a country which is stuck in between, along with development. I guess we are doing, and we have to look at expansion of our nuclear arsenal, as well as our conventional forces. The priority one being conventional forces. Nuclear, we got to be careful. We do not want to get, or we should not get into an arms race. We must have only that much that will help us to maintain a minimum credible deterrence posture. With this, I finish. We now open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, General Sharma. I think we have heard some excellent presentations. I have a couple of questions to kick off our discussion. Let me just throw one question at Toby. Toby, you noticed, I kind of noticed one thing, that you talked of nuclear balance in Southern Asia, you talked of Chinese status of Chinese forces, capabilities, and so on. You talked of India and Pakistan as well. Now, I mean, Manpreet's talked of quad, as it were. I mean, a quadrilateral, because she brought in the United States. Hannah also talked of the chain, and General Sharma talked of how on the nuclear domain we kind of see it. So, I mean, just an opportunity for you, because you ignored the US factor, whereas the other three speakers brought in the China-US factor quite strongly. Do you have any particular reasons or any particular comments in that regard?
It's a good observation. I guess what I would say is that the geometry of the region is a really interesting question. And each type of geometry, whether it's a strategic chain or a triangle, and if so, kind of what is the directionality of the triangle, and which are the vertices, you know, those bring different assumptions and different variables for thinking about or sort of explaining what is happening or has happened in the region. And I've actually spent quite a bit of time on this and have a very long paper that's a book chapter in a forthcoming volume that looks exactly at this question of geometry. And the model that I ended up with was a quad that I described as kind of the US and China as sort of strategic competitors, and India and Pakistan as regional competitors, and complex, and you know, with relationships between India, the United States and India, and between China and Pakistan, and then with complex stuff happening in the middle. And I think it's important to recognize the role of the United States, and particularly its aspirations to build partnerships with India that are, I mean, I'll say it, others are a little bit more careful, but the underlying objective there is to make sure China is kind of kept in a box, if you will. Containment is maybe a strong term, but it's very much designed to diminish, mitigate more aggressive Chinese behavior in its near abroad. And so the role, the US does have a role to play then in these questions of what creates risk, what mitigates risk, and what drives changes in nuclear balance, what drives capability acquisition, how does it shape perceptions. So I fully accept that it belongs there. And I guess the thing that for me is the most interesting question, regardless of the US role, regardless of the geometry, because this question applies to the strategic chain too, is how tightly coupled are China and India in the deterrence equation. And if you take my contention, which is that they're not tightly coupled and haven't been and really don't need to be going forward, then that spillover effect from US to China, China to India, India to Pakistan is not going to be very dynamic. If you think, on the other hand, that India needs to be much more responsive to developments in China on a one-for-one basis or in an offsetting way, then that deterrence becomes more linked, more coupled. And that will change the way that the region looks and the risks that come with it. So for me, that's kind of the most interesting thing. And that's why I sort of left the US out of my analysis.
Okay. Thank you. I think, well, let me just put it like this. If any of the others also want to come in at any point on any of this discussion that we are currently having, please feel free to do so. I have one more question, which is maybe, I think, Hannah, you talked about things like pre-notification of missile tests and, how if you can kind of have capabilities or tests notified in advance, it acts as confidence building. And I was just thinking about it. I mean, Toby had talked of entanglement, and others have also talked of the linkages between the cyber and space and all of that, and the growing dependence on many of these links. And by definition, offensive cyber capabilities are not going to be pre-notified. I mean, there is no, I mean, they are essentially capabilities that are developed covertly and then deployed. I mean, they're not going to get notified. So how do you get around that particular kind of a challenge? What does it do to stability that you were talking about promoting through certain kinds of transparency, confidence building, etc.?
Thank you, sir. I think that's a really interesting question. My answer would be that the most productive place for us to start and the most useful place for us to start is with norms. So, we think about what are the things that no state wants to see happen, that it's in no one's best interest, and then we start there and build up in terms of creating normative expectations that will induce stability. So, for example, again, I'm going to quote Tong Zhao, who's one of my favorite scholars lately. Yesterday at this event I hosted on emerging technologies, he proposed that an easy norm on cyber could be a commitment to not use offensive cyber capabilities in a way that would affect your adversary's command and control structure. So I don't know why I called that easy, maybe not easy, but that could be one norm that could be perpetrated or further. And then another, perhaps nearer term one could be, I can't remember who proposed this. It was some kind of Simpson publication, but someone proposed taking the non-attack agreement that India and Pakistan have and expanding that to cyber. I think it was in the off-ramps book. Toby, I hope that wasn't your proposal.
It was almost my proposal. It was similar to that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that would be my answer, that you start with norms. And, some of those can be serious on paper public norms, and perhaps some of the more important ones will be really quiet backroom norms that are born of track 2 dialogues, where we talk about what are those shared risks we all want to avoid, and what are ways that we can mitigate them together.
Okay, thank you. Manpreet, I mean, you heard this and you talked of the fact that in the Pakistan seeks ambiguity, and there is or Pakistan does not have a desire for stability in that India-Pakistan equation. And you said that similarly, China finds comfort in not seeing stability or injecting a degree of instability. So where do norms, something like what Hannah is talking about, how would you get norms into a relationship where at least one of the players finds benefit in injecting a dose of instability? Any thoughts? Anybody?
Exactly.
I mean.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of thoughts on that. In fact, when Hannah first mentioned it, to say that she was pushing me on that, to, in the belief that they are not actually, I mean, China particularly, as you mentioned, was not doing this because it it believes in the promotion of norms. I don't think that's the China that we know in India, which is in any way interested in promoting these norms of, in fact, strategic stability is a norm between two adversarial nuclear countries, because the understanding is that you don't want crisis instability to come up. But what we find in the case, and sitting in the middle, India finds both with Pakistan and with China, there is this tendency to create instability. In the case of Pakistan, it is to carry on with acts of terrorism, because if there was stability at the highest level, then conventional war becomes a problem for them, and therefore terrorism cannot happen. So till the time that terrorism is not given up, the acceptability of this norm of having strategic stability doesn't appeal to them. And I understand it from their perspective. The only thing is it becomes a problem for India and for the rest of the world in terms of the worries about what escalation can happen. And in the case of China, because of the erosion of deterrence that they feel because of US capability, and it's not just the nuclear capability that worries them, it's across the spectrum, the conventional capabilities as well. In fact, what set them off was the US BMD and the conventional prompt global strike, which seemed as if it would hit their nuclear assets, and therefore the need for creating that ambiguity by co-location of missiles, by declaring missiles as nuclear or dual use capable, because then you don't know. Then the tendency in America would be to hold back because you don't know what you're going to hit, and that there would be inadvertent escalation. So this, I do understand, and I myself have been a votary of promotion of norms, but it seems highly difficult at a time when different countries are perceiving how they're going to operationalize their deterrence differently. In fact, Hannah, your mechanisms for communication, restraint, transparency, excellent ideas. But what do you do when you have a problem of mistrust with Pakistan? I mean, India and Pakistan have had the best of CBMs at the conventional and nuclear level, and look at the relationship and what it is. And in the case of China, there is an attitude problem. They don't regard you as a nuclear weapon state. So, if there are no strategic dialogues that look at nuclear issues between the two of them, despite the fact, and here if I can just take a minute to also mention something that Toby had said about the decoupled deterrence relationship. Yes, there is that understanding that between India and China, the nuclear issue doesn't matter that much because of, I would say, the similarity of approach to nuclear weapons, where both of us think that nuclear weapons are not for war fighting. They are meant only for last resort for nuclear retaliation. So that similarity of approach has led to the perception that there is this sense of decoupled deterrence. But I don't know whether to call it coupled, decoupled, whatever nomenclature we give to it. The fact is that we are in a deterrent relationship, and therefore capabilities and perceptions of capabilities do matter. And unless we talk to each other on these, that's not going to be resolved. And they don't want to talk to you because they still tell you that you are under UN Security Council Resolution 1172 and not a nuclear weapon state. So how do you square this circle? It's a huge problem here.
So if I can add on to what Manpreet is saying.
Sure.
See, that is the basic problem. We do not want to be coupled, or move the way the Chinese are moving or be influenced by what they're doing. But I guess there is no option, because if they are building up to face the United States and become a global power, the hard fact is that we are neighbors and our relations are, again, at an all-time low. And Pakistan on the other side is continuing with state-sponsored terrorism, which is not ending. So I guess to maintain a credible minimum deterrence in terms of nuclear, we have no option but to, modernize and keep pace so that we're not into an arms race. But we have enough to create stability, because if we are not strong enough, it would lead to a condition of instability, which is dangerous. So that is why we have no option but to modernize. And this point about cyber and offensive capability that Anna mentioned, I think that's a very good point about, having a norm of not targeting each other's command and control system. But the only thing is that if you want to go in for a first strike, I'm not talking about India and China. Another word on India and China is that in the 8 months long crisis, the word nuclear was not mentioned at all. And this is possibly because both of us had no first use pass. So I said NFU does have a standing even today. Coming back to the offensive cyber, I guess if somebody wants a first strike, the first thing you'd like to target is somebody's command and control systems. And I don't think anybody would be prepared to have norms to say, I will not do it. But the other way of looking at it is that I'm sure everybody's command and control systems are reasonably safe. They're standalone systems. And I guess they're carrying out the security and safety audits on a very, very regular basis based on developments, and to make sure that the command and control systems are not interfered with. You see, because the moment the command and control systems are interfered with, it again leads to tremendous instability. And it's a disparity between the two, which again leads to static instability, which is dangerous. So I guess as one of the questions also about cyber on command and control systems, I feel they're all standalone systems, and all of us ought to be focusing on how safe they are against cyber attacks on a very regular basis. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Any, Anna, you or Toby, any of you want to come in?
Yeah, if I could,
Sure.
I want to follow up a little bit on the China-India dynamic and to push just a little bit further. So on the one hand, there's more similarities than differences, I think, in Chinese nuclear thinking and Indian nuclear thinking. China, for the last 40 years, has lived with a very small arsenal as compared to the arsenals of the United States and Russia, before that Soviet Union. And even now, as China modernizes, the projected size of its arsenal is still an order of magnitude less than what the US has. If there's such similarities between Chinese and Indian thinking, would it not be also the case that India could live with some numerical disparity with China, provided that you still have credible minimum deterrence and survivability for second strike? So that would be one question. And then secondly, for General Sharma, if India does adopt MIRVs, which you articulated were perceived as a first strike capability, that seems to put a lot of pressure on communicating then to others that MIRVs aren't a first strike threat by showing something about posture. So how do you credibly convey to others through posture, and not visible posture, not just declaratory policy, that MIRVs shouldn't be seen as a first strike weapon, but in fact are a way of bolstering your retaliatory capability for second strike?
Thank you. Toby, one thing, I think it is important to remember that one reason why China did not feel a compulsion to expand its arsenal was that after 1971, it did not perceive the US as a threat. So, where was the need? There was, and by after 79 and gradually, so it is only in the late 1990s that China began to modernize. And as far as Soviet Union or subsequently Russia is concerned, they had settled their boundary. So they did not perceive a threat, or they did not have a similar threat perception as, let's say, the threat perception that couples India and China, because we have had an outstanding issue which has not been resolved despite various dialogue at various levels. Regarding the MIRVs, General Sharma, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks. See, 2 points what Toby has raised. One is the numerical numbers between India and China, and second is about the MIRVs. I'll take the MIRVs first. Firstly, I'd like to clarify that this is my opinion, and it is not the opinion of the establishment, which might be totally different from mine. So I'm giving you totally my opinion. The way I look at it is that if you are a no first use power and you have to absorb a first strike, now it's very, very difficult and a dangerous guess to say how much of your weapons would be destroyed in the enemy's first strike, because anybody is going in for a first strike, their intention and would be to make sure that you got nothing left and you cannot respond. Otherwise, if the adversary knows that you have even a small arsenal left to respond, I don't think they launch a first strike. So that is the basic premise that you take. Now, in case we have to absorb a first strike, it's very, very difficult for us to say as to how much of the arsenal would be left. And therefore, whatever is left, you must get the maximum bang for the buck, if you put it like that. And if you have some amount of missile with more warheads, I guess that would give you a more credible second strike capability, whether in terms of actual use or even to demonstrate and tell the other person that you are capable of hitting back. So that is the way I look at it. You see, everything is not that if you have something, you want to use it first time. Like I brought out at the initial stages, our psychology is not to use nuclear weapons for war fighting, because I think as sane and rational people, we know that a first use will bring about a second strike on yourself, and that is going to cause massive destruction. So if that is our psychology, if that is our stated doctrine, I feel that to have good weapon systems which are accurate and will get to the targets is essential. And that is why I'm saying my recommendation is that we must go in for more accurate MIRVs if required for such kind of weapons.
Thank you. Anna? Sorry.
Sorry, the second point about the numerical difference between China and India, Toby, you're 100% right. We do not have to match China numbers for numbers, and we are not doing that. Even if you see today, there is a massive disparity between the numbers which are quoted by CIPRI and the other think tanks on what China's got and what they want to do and what India's got and where we want to reach. Our thought process is very clear. We want to have enough numbers which are capable of carrying out our stated doctrine. And the credible minimum deterrence is what we want to have. We are not matching China numbers for numbers. We can't afford to do that. And it is not required. And the fact that you're right again, that there is a lot of similarity between their doctrines and our doctrines. And that is why possibly, like we said, in the standoff, recent standoff, nuclear weapons were not even mentioned. Nobody even thought about it. Nobody even discussed it. Because all of us realize that being NFU, it has advantages and the nuclear factor is kept down. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay. Anna, you have your hand up. You wanted to come in.
I do, yes. I just wanted to respond to Manpreet briefly on strategic stability, because I think it's sort of the only productive thing that we can talk about in this conversation as we discuss shared risk. I agree with you, ma'am, that there are good academic rationales for why certain states in this strategic chain might benefit from or encourage certain interstate crises. The point I would make is that there are levels, right? So strategic stability means a lot of things to a lot of people. I have made the argument in a couple articles that China's incentive structure for militarized, highly escalatory interstate crises between India and Pakistan has shifted. And as it continues to implement these connectivity projects, its economic investments in stability in the region at that militarized level, the use of military force, it's changing its own interest, China's own interest in ensuring that things don't get out of hand below its southern border, right? And I would say that incentive structure, we're seeing similar shifts for India as its role in the region grows and the US's reliance on India as a key strategic partner increases. And then the question sort of for me is, where does Pakistan fit in all of this? And I think it's worth noting that the rhetoric, at least coming out of Islamabad these days through things like Moeed Yusuf's Islamabad dialogue and some of the speeches made by General Bajwa and Prime Minister Imran Khan suggests that Pakistan might be trying to move in a direction that would also increase its economic incentives to prevent highly militarized interstate crises. So if I was running the world, that's where I'd start with risk reduction and with promoting norms that increase stability.
Well, I think we've got a bunch. Thank you, Anna. Manpreet, unless you want to come in or any such thing, I think there are quite a few questions.
Very quick response, sir. I do want to believe what Hannah is saying, but we've been here before. You know, we've been at this juncture several times before. I hope this is different. I think all of us want that to happen. But you know, hope doesn't make for a good strategy. So planks have to be covered still.
Sure, sure. I think, happy? Are you, Gaurav, happy?
I have a question. I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you. I mean, thank you, Ambassador Sood. Allow me to sort of highlight once again the China-India nuclear situation in the context of the recent territorial standoff and the growing fears of a collusive or collaborative two-front situation. These are in some ways what prompted us to sort of put together this round table. So let me unpack this a little more, but very quickly. What we witnessed in the recent past are the following. Chinese territorial revisionism, increasing land grab attempts on the line of actual control, the end of China's peaceful rise in some ways. And I think these things are only going to increase in the years to come. Also consider China's conventional superiority and increasing cyber capabilities vis-a-vis India. China's conventional capabilities are bound to increase with the rise of Quad and the heightening of Sino-US competition. The possibility of a fait accompli, and a lot of people have discussed in the recent past, the fait accompli trapped by China on the line of actual control is also real. China has tasted blood, and I think this sort of fait accompli situation is going to be increasing in the years to come. Finally, the recent reports of cyber attacks against India by China are alarming, even though the government of India is in denial mode on this. So the question is this, and it may be a highly speculative one: does the situation warrant from India investment in low-yield nuclear weapons, at least for signaling purposes? Let me put that question differently. At what point should nuclear signaling towards China from India come into play? And is that useful at all? I think this pertains, in my mind, to a larger conceptual question. What are nuclear weapons supposed to deter? Only nuclear attacks, or are there other purposes as well? Now, it certainly helps a conventionally superior and territorially aggressive China to say that nuclear weapons are a last resort. Does it really help India to say that to China? I know it sort of sounds like doing a Pakistan to China by India, but I just want to sort of put that on the table. You can crucify me for saying that, but I just want to put that on the table.
Thank you, Happy. I think, but if you are going to bring in tactical nuclear weapons and signaling and all of that, then obviously you have to say goodbye to a lot of existing doctrinal things. And I think General Sharma was very categorical when he said that according to him, there is A, no room for ambiguity, B, NFU should stay, C, instability is not desirable, and which means, as he explained, that, so all of that. So, and I don't know, but I mean, the others are more than welcome to respond to Happymon. He's really thrown a cat among the pigeons.
I would put the question back to you, Happymon. Do you think that Pakistan's assertion of lower use thresholds as having closed the space for conventional military options has been effective against India?
I don't know. I don't think mine is a purely academic question. I mean, this is not really a policy one. I mean, I think you have what is happening between India and Pakistan is a reality, right? The Pakistanis have tried to use the tactical nuclear weapons as a ploy to sort of make a certain argument vis-a-vis India. If you go beyond this point, that this is likely to happen. Now, that's the reality. I'm simply asking, does the India-China situation warrant that kind of a signaling, even if that doesn't become a reality? I mean, I believe in this argument that the nuclear weapons are weapons of last resort, but who does it help? Does it really help a conventionally weaker power vis-a-vis a conventionally superior power? And the latter has clearly drawn blood, and it may continue to draw blood. So does the situation really warrant the moralistic statement, quote unquote, that hey, we are not going to talk about nuclear weapons at all. I mean, this is just a hypothetical question.
Toby, the answer to your question very simply is depends on what is the role you attribute to nuclear weapons. I mean, if I think that it was supposed to have defended me against that particular threat, then perhaps it narrows my options. But if I think that my nuclear weapons are not intended to cater to that threat, then it does not constrain my options. I mean, this is when Kargil happened, there were a number of Western scholars who said, oh, what did nuclear weapons achieve? But nuclear weapons were never supposed to prevent something like Kargil or something like a Mumbai 2611. So it depends on what is the role you attribute. I think this is also a question that has been posed. I'm sorry, that has been posed by Akash Sahu, who has talked of limited kind of war, very similar to what tactical nuclear weapons and nuclear signaling. And he's talked of the fact that whether India has moved away from a policy of strategic restraint post 2016. So and the fact whether how, I think his other question about arms control in South Asia between India and Pakistan is obviously something that has already been addressed. But Manpreet, you wanted to come in?
I did,
Yeah.
sir. Thank you, because Happy Mon really raised a provocative question, and you call it an academic question, Happy Mon, but you know that all of this goes into policy recommendations as well. And I think I have other people on the panel who would agree with me to say that TNWs is not the answer to conventional asymmetry with China. There is the whole dime spectrum, diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And within military, from low-level conventional to high-level conventional, there is a huge spectrum available to address some of the threats that we perceive from China. Going the nuclear way with the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, I mean, even from the Cold War period, this has never proven itself to be a good idea. The concept of proportionate deterrence, somebody mentioned proportionate deterrence in our talk earlier. I don't think there is anything like proportionate deterrence, or the idea that you could use TNWs, you use 2 and then we use 4 and somebody else uses 3 again. That's not the way to do nuclear deterrence. What is proportionate deterrence? Is it about the number of weapons you're going to use? Is it about the amount of damage you're going to cause? Is it about the number of people who vaporize within a second? Is it about the area that is going to become radioactive? What is proportionate deterrence? Who's going to determine what is proportionate? And therefore, since escalation at this level cannot be controlled, the whole idea of tactical nuclear weapons is bunkum. In fact, that's why I think Toby raised such a valid question about how much have we believed when Pakistan says they will use tactical nuclear weapons. And if it's only to be said, but it doesn't look credible, then what is credible deterrence all about? Deterrence is nuclear deterrence is a mind game. It's about perception management. And if you're just saying that you will use TNW, but you don't intend to do it, then it doesn't make sense at all. So I think what India has is a very sane and stabilizing deterrence doctrine. And we don't need to temper with it to say that TNWs is a good idea. It's a bait which has been let out. And I would say the US is as much a culprit in bringing back this idea of TNWs by started talking about limited nuclear war. There is nothing like a limited nuclear war. It's an oxymoron, and nobody has ever proven that you can fight a limited nuclear war. And therefore, I have major problems with both the idea of limited nuclear war and proportionate deterrence. I think what we are doing is perfect, and we don't need to sort of get into the idea of TNWs. It hasn't helped anyone, and it will just eat away our resources and create misperceptions, which will not be helpful. It will rather create security dilemmas for us.
And if I may say 30 seconds more, Happy, what you said, to add on to what Manpreet said, the US in NPR 18 spoke of limited war, and I believe they've deployed low-yield weapons on one of the SSBNs. But that has been refuted by the US administration itself. The new president does not agree with it. There are enough senators in the US Senate who are saying that there is no such thing as a limited war. And any nuclear exchange is going to spiral out of control and lead to complete annihilation. So Happy, as far as nuclear is concerned, like I said earlier, you must say what you mean and what you can do. Just making statements, to tell the other child will get scared or something, I think that's not the answer. It must be very, very specific what you say. And the answer to cyber attacks on, Mumbai or something like that is definitely not tactical nuclear weapons. We must develop a cyber and other capabilities and act accordingly, but keep the nuclear dimension out of it. And I fully endorse what Manpreet has just said. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. I think that to an extent, that answers Toby's question in the sense of what is the role that you attribute to nuclear weapons. So if nuclear weapons are not, but this is where the key difference arises. But if Pakistan says full spectrum deterrence, then what exactly does full spectrum mean? Does it mean subconventional war, cyber, etc., or not? In India's case, it is very clear that we attribute a very limited role for nuclear weapons. So to that extent, if you have to deal with other threats, then you have to develop appropriate capabilities. It is not like there is only one muscle that has to then cope with all other things. You need different muscles to enable you to walk, to enable you to pick up something, to enable you to move your head, and so on and so on. And this also addresses the question that was there, I noticed, by Usama Nizamani, who said that should we have a more flexible nuclear posture? I think Manpreet and General Sharma have addressed that quite definitively. And if there is nobody else who wants to take the comment, I think we have a number of questions from Hiroaki Nakanishi, who's talked of South Asia and Indo-Pacific and in terms of strategic stability. Now, the question is about how can it be linked to transparency, and that is something which is relevant to what Hannah was talking about. And Nakanishi also says that is there possibility for a post-INF treaty framework which would bring in China, and also on cyberspace, etc., hypersonics, cruise, and different kinds of technologies that are increasingly seen as somewhat destabilizing. Now, as I see it, if you go back into the history of US-Soviet arms control, I think perhaps till such time as once the Soviets exploded their thermonuclear capability and demonstrated their thermonuclear power, that is the first time that there was a sense that perhaps there was a mutual vulnerability. But it took a crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis for that mutual vulnerability to come into play, thereby leading to the beginning of arms control. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the US has never conceded mutual vulnerability to China, and that is one of the reasons why there has been no US-China arms control. But perhaps, Hannah, would you like to address some of the questions that Nakanishi has posed?
Can try. I appreciate the questions, and I know that you also submitted similar questions for my event yesterday, and I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them. I think they're thoughtful, and I look forward to reading your doctoral papers on them hopefully soon. But in terms of a response to them, I don't have a clear one. I think it's useful to think about incentive structures, because as Manpreet has compellingly observed, arms control and risk reduction aren't a thing until all parties really do have a shared incentive structure. So Ambassador Sood, I would agree with you that the United States government seems interested primarily in talking about nuclear risk reduction and arms control with Russia and China right now. I wonder if there might be sufficient incentives for all parties, including India and Pakistan, at some point in the future to look at not arms control, but some of these transparency mechanisms, risk reduction mechanisms, insofar as they could address new risks. So that's a lot of what my research is on, is thinking about what are the crisis scenarios we can envision where the United States is busy in North Korea, for example, with a crisis, and then a second crisis spins up in the Indo-Pacific. And are we prepared to deal with those? And do we have mechanisms for communications to avoid these advanced militarized interstate disputes that I do think all states have an incentive to reduce risk for? The other area I think that, one day we could see the US, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, others pursuing risk reduction together, and would be, again, with some novel onset scenarios. So what do some of these newer capabilities and technologies, what can they do to how crises might spin up? And are there ways that we can talk about norms together to address those? So it's not a very satisfying answer, but that's all I've got right now.
I see the point about incentives. My point is that even in the US-Soviet case, the incentive came when mutual vulnerability was conceded. Now, without conceding mutual vulnerability, how do you create that incentive? And now that is basically, I've had discussions with my Chinese friends over years on this, and they've said, well, why should we engage in arms control? They've also studied the history of US-Soviet arms control, as I'm sure everybody has, and that's why I raised this counterfactual at the outset, saying that had the nuclear age opened in Asia, perhaps the history and vocabulary of arms control would have been entirely different, as would have been the terminology used for deterrence. Yeah, sorry, Manpreet. Manpreet, while you had your response, but I think there's also a question specifically addressed, which I think you can also deal with. Javed Alam is suggesting that, since I'm sure you would have seen Nina Tannenwald's recent piece, article at Stimson about the nuclear taboo between India and Pakistan. And whether do you think that this taboo is an established norm between India and Pakistan, or do you think that the stability-instability paradox is what explains or flows into the nuclear relationship between India and Pakistan? So if you could, after making your point, if you could just address that too.
Thanks. So on arms control in the region, and I would say even globally, I don't see more future for the START or the INF variety of arms control any longer, because of the asymmetry in numbers. START, etc., were essentially because there was a parity in numbers, that you were looking at ceilings of certain kinds on the numbers. But since the number game is not what is happening, anymore, that kind of arms control doesn't look possible. Transparency in the region, verification of arms control, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. It's a bridge which looks very far right now. In fact, Hannah, since you are at Sandia, and I remember Sandia conducting this exercise where India and Pakistan were exposed to how verification of dismantlement of ballistic missiles can take place. And the idea was, as the missiles become obsolescent, you could do this mutual verification of the dismantlement of the missiles. And I remember the Pakistani participant then saying that in India and Pakistan, we believe in the idea of jugaad. So nothing ever gets dismantled because you can use it for something else. And therefore, you can, the point of, mentioning this anecdote is, this is the understanding of where we are in terms of doing that kind of arms control. However, I do think some soft CBMs is the way to go. And I would, for instance, here mention having a dialogue on these issues, which has been missing for such a long period of time. joint statements if possible. You know, between India and China, we have had the possibility of a joint statement on NFU, which unfortunately, because of the Galwan attack, went away. Some kind of joint studies between India, Pakistan, China on deterrence breakdown. I don't think in this region there is the understanding of what would happen. You know, we haven't seen movies like The Day After or documentaries like Threads to show what deterrence breakdown is all about. So some kind of those joint studies by think tanks, by, you know, some movie makers, art exhibitions, things like that might be the way to go. On the issue of nuclear taboo, it's not just India, Pakistan that have respected that nuclear taboo. I think it exists at the global level. The fact that we haven't had the use of a nuclear weapon, despite the US sometimes being in a position where it could have gotten away with the use of that weapon, is essentially because of this nuclear taboo, which over the last 75 years, I think has grown stronger to some extent. But the more we start talking about ideas of limited nuclear war, then that's an attack on the nuclear taboo. So it's India and Pakistan and India and China have the understanding of nuclear weapons being of a certain kind, of a different category. And therefore, that nuclear taboo, I think, holds as much in the region as it does globally. And it's everybody's responsibility to strengthen it as much as possible. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Toby?
Yeah, if I could have two fingers here,
Sure.
just to respond and build on a couple points. So, Ambassador Sood, you observed that the importance of mutual vulnerability to arms control is I think, key going forward.
No, I said it was the key that underwrote US-Soviet. Whether you necessarily want to go down that route to create incentives in future, I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll find other ways of creating incentives.
Fair.
So I take Hannah's point that you need incentives, but in the US-Soviet instance, the incentive came from accepting mutual vulnerability.
And in addition to mutual vulnerability, you also had agreement to limit ABMs, right?
Correct.
And so
that was to ensure, that was to underwrite mutual vulnerability.
Correct. And so once then you have the US withdrawal from the ABM treaty and the growth of BMD, arms control becomes much harder. And so I think a question for the Biden administration, and it also relates to how you could imagine building on restraints in South Asia, is could you see agreement to limit missile defenses as a way of enabling stability and mutual vulnerability at a time when missile defenses in your region are still fairly nascent technologies that would seem to be more plausible than once a lot of money and manpower and institutions become invested in them. Just to observe that interplay. And I think, you know, Russia has been quite clear, and I think this is true for China too, that in the US context, probably it's difficult to go any further with arms control in a meaningful sense without some US agreement to limit BMD.
But in addition to mutual vulnerability was also the notion of parity that underwrote a lot of the kind of arms control agreements that Manpreet was referring to. And so none of these two preconditions exist. So, I mean, obviously you have to find a new template. Hannah?
So respectfully, sir, I would disagree with you. I think we do have mutual vulnerability. I agree that we could do a better job of recognizing what it is, but at some level, all of these states have things that they don't want to happen. And one just quick example I would give you is that during the Nuclear Security Summit process, Prime Minister Modi, I thought, made some really interesting points and offers actually for Indian leadership on dealing with the mutual vulnerability that all states in the global system have to terrorism, and specifically to terrorism that could involve nuclear radiological materials, right? So there was an Indian offer, and then for a variety of reasons, it didn't take place, to have a heads of state summit to address this risk and to talk about things like information sharing mechanisms. If there's terrorists on my borders that I catch with uranium, for example, which there are reports of having just happened last week in Nepal on India's border. Is there a mechanism that we could have where we share information on that? We share perhaps tactics, tools, technologies to prevent that shared vulnerability to non-state actors that would undermine nuclear security. That's my 2 fingers.
Okay, well, my vulnerability was in the manner in which it existed between US, Soviet Union, but in any case, yes, I mean, in a globalized world, we are all mutually vulnerable, whether it is climate change or whether it is non-state actors engaging in terrorism. Manpreet, do you want to answer this question? Should India go in for another nuclear test to mark its presence? This is a question from Mr. Alok Chandan.
Well, India doesn't need to conduct a nuclear test to mark its presence. I think it's being felt very much across the region and the world. India is recognized in many, many ways. So you don't have to conduct a test to draw attention to yourself.
I think so.
I mean, you would want to do it for reasons of deterrence, but in my understanding, even that is not needed because deterrence is not dependent on that certainty of the test, rather than instead of just on the belief that deterrence is going to work. So no, we don't need to conduct another test.
I think there was one question on the idea that if there was a cyber attack on India's civilian nuclear facilities, then would we consider it a nuclear attack? And I think that has already been addressed, that no, I mean, given the sole purpose, that is not what we are looking at. There's one question from Hiroaki Nakanishi, and I'm afraid which is addressed to General Sharma and Hana and Manpreet, saying that is there a possibility to develop a standard communication code in nuclear command and control area like the one our navies are using? Frankly, I don't know whether all navies use a standard communication code or not, but do all navies use a standard communication code, General Sharma? I mean, do you have any idea about that? Or is there a possibility theoretically to develop a standard communication code to prevent miscommunications?
You see, the navies, if I'm not wrong, they're not a standard communication code, but I think they have a system of communicating with the other people as and when required. Possibly, I might be wrong because I'm not too sure about it. But I'm not clear as to what kind of a communication do they want on the nuclear aspect. Why on the nuclear command and control? You know, we could have communications on the other channels also, like we have today with Pakistan and other countries. So I'm not really clear as to what exact communication is the person asking. But do you see the command and control system is something which is totally different. It should be a standalone system which is only meant for command and control. There's nothing else on that. But for communications, to keep channels open, I guess we could, yes.
Yeah, but that's two separate things.
Two separate things altogether, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with you, General Sharma, that the question's a little unclear, but I do think it's getting at an interesting idea, which people on this panel and elsewhere have written on, which is that there's a case to be made that we don't have a common lexicon or set of vocabulary among nuclear armed states to talk about some of our capabilities and delivery systems, and that coming to some kind of common lexicon at a much lower level than strategic stability might be helpful. And I think there have been some useful efforts to do that, certainly bilaterally, and perhaps one day they can happen at a multilateral level.
Well, there is one more interesting question that has just been put on by Hiroaki Nakanishi, saying that is a nuclear risk reduction aspect, would that be a more convincing incentive for China to join nuclear arms control? So any ideas if nuclear risk reduction? But then you will need to get into what kind of measures are nuclear risk reduction. And I guess it would also have to be something that could gel with, I mean, like nuclear risk reduction and no first use is a clear nuclear risk reduction approach. But then how does that square with extended deterrence obligations and all the rest of it? So any thoughts? Is there a nuclear risk reduction aspect that could act as an incentive to bring China in?
Provided the leadership in China understands those nuclear risks and it recognizes that risks are being created by the kind of capability build-up and strategy that they're formulating. And, Hannah has mentioned Tang Zhao several times. Well, in his understanding, that comprehension of risks, at least in the public domain by Chinese leaders, is missing. So therefore, unless they recognize the risk, how do you incentivize them?
Okay. Any other comments by anybody? Otherwise, I think we have addressed all the questions, and we've had a fairly interesting discussion among ourselves as well. And Happy did his best to provoke by putting a cat among the pigeons. I hope you were satisfied with the responses that you got, Happy.
I'm waiting for your response. You haven't, you conveniently avoided me.
No, I don't. You know my views on that. But anyway, I think we've had a very productive, very useful discussion, a very frank exchange, and some interesting ideas have been thrown up. So let me hand the mic back to Gaurav.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. This has been a fascinating discussion, so much to chew on, and we'll be putting out the video very soon. On behalf of everyone at CSDR, I would like to thank all the panelists for taking out time, presenting their views, so making this an excellent discussion. I would also like to thank all the people who joined in to listen to the discussion. We had a lot of questions, very interesting questions. So thank you for all the questions. To know more about what we do at CSDR, you can visit our website, csdronline.org. You can also follow our Twitter handle, CSDR_India, to keep yourself updated on more such events and to basically access the videos of this event as well as other roundtables that we've done. So once again, thank you everyone, and stay safe. As we decided at the beginning of this discussion, that perhaps COVID-19 is a bigger challenge right now. So stay safe, and thank you so much.
Well, let me just add my word of thanks to Gaurav's, and also, by the way, Hannah, I was very, I must say, I am going to write an email to Bob Einhorn just now to tell him, because I wrote one to him earlier, since I had to work twice as hard to get this concept of nuclear dyads loosely linked with varying degrees of correlations into nuclear chains into that report. So that was an uphill task. And so last time somebody else used this phrase. I wrote to Bob and I said, by the way, you will be glad to know. So now I'll write to him again to tell him that the term that report coined for the first time has now gained even wider currency. So thanks a lot. And once again, thank you everybody for a wonderful session, and stay safe.